Have you ever followed a reference perfectly, but your watercolor still didn't work? Most of the time, that's not about skill. It's about planning. Even if you're not a professional painter, good planning already takes you almost all the way there. So today I'll walk you through how I personally plan a watercolor step by step before the brush ever touches the paper. Whenever I look at a reference picture, I always break it down into 2 steps. The first step is reading the reference properly, especially in terms of values. And then the second step is choosing the colors and translating what I see into watercolor. When I read values, the easiest way for me to do it, and honestly the reason why I created my tonal values and Masstone scale, is to simplify everything into one question. Is the subject in the light or in the shadow? If something's in the light, I know I'm roughly working in values 1 to 5. If it's in the shadow, I'm working with values 6 to 10. 5 and 6 are transition points. They're a little tricky to read. They could be either light or shadow. And by the way, for those who've been asking about my tonal values and Masstone scale, I do have it available on Etsy. So if you're interested, I'll just leave the link down below. So back to the reference. In this case, the duck is mostly in the shadow. So you can see this side is in the shadow. And there are highlights, 1 and 2. So 1 is the head and 1 is the right side of the body. But the main mass of the duck sits in the shadow. So right away, I know I'm not dealing with super light values. In fact, I'll be looking at values 6 to 9. And when I start planning colors and values, I always start from the subject, from the focal points. So which ones are the focal points? I want to capture the glow, so the one focal point will be the beak. The eye is also a focal point, but in this picture, it doesn't matter as much as the beak or the belly. The belly is also where the light is interesting to me. I want to capture these 2 points in this painting. It's interesting to me also how the belly transitions into the back of the duck. It's a nice soft transition I want to recreate in my painting, and also how the feet are reflecting the light. One other thing that I'll be keeping in mind in this painting is that the background is not going to be exactly like this background. It is going to be a little darker compared to the duck, but I'll be working more with temperature contrast. So the background is going to be warmer. I'll talk about this later. However, I'll be applying a wash of yellow ochre. I'll be overlapping some phthalo blue to make that olivey green you can see in the reference picture. The rocks are important, but not as important as the duck. For the rocks, I'll be keeping them on the lighter side of things, and I'll be using cool colors. I'll be having all this section here that's going to be cool, and the background is going to be warm. So now I'll start swatching my colors, and let's start with the beak. And for this, I want to start roughly around value 6. And I know that my yellows usually sit between value 2 and 4. And I also know that orange doesn't really go darker than value 6. I will start with a base of orange, and it could be an orange straight out of a tube, but I like to make it a little more interesting. So I think I'll be using some yellow plus some kind of quinacridone magenta or quinacridone red. It doesn't matter. The effect is going to be the same at the end. And because we said that the duck is in the shade, we're looking at values 6 to 9. The beak is orange. It's perfect because it's already living on value 6, and it's Masstone. Masstone is basically when you squeeze a paint out of the tube in its creamy consistency. It's 6. It doesn't get any darker than 6, but you can make it darker. So this beak is going to be around value 6 and 7. So we're going to start with some kind of primary yellow as the base. And then to this yellow, I'll be adding a touch of magenta, not too much, just enough to make it interesting. You see, it can be lighter, darker. It can vary as you paint. And the consistency needs to be creamy to get to this intensity. So you want creamy paint on your brush, like this. And this beak is kind of muted, right? To mute this beak, I'll be choosing cobalt blue, and I'll tell you why in a second. First of all, one reason is blue is the opposite, is the complementary color to orange. So if you add blue, you're going to neutralize the beak. But why cobalt blue in particular? I could have chosen indigo or phthalo blue, but I'm going for cobalt blue because it's very gentle and it's Masstone. It's not that dark. It's one of the lightest blues that are still on the warmer side of blues. What do I mean by that? And by the way, French ultramarine light works really well too. So cobalt blue sits around value 7 to 8. And so when you mix it with this kind of orange that's on value 6, you don't need to be that careful because it's not an overpowering blue. It's quite forgiving to mix it with any kind of orange without it overpowering the mix. You see, it doesn't take over the mix. It just simply neutralizes it very gently. And that's all I want for this beak, because this beak you can still read it as orange. And in fact, look at this. For me, this is actually the perfect intensity, chroma, color, you name it. For me, it's a really good match. I could also have used indigo or burnt umber, but you need to be a little more careful, or even phthalo blue, but you need to be more careful because those colors are on the darker side of things. So if you want to use them with this kind of mix, they need to be more diluted, or you just need to get a little tiny dot of that color in a creamy consistency. For me, just for risk management, the safest one is cobalt blue. You can pick up a lot and it's not going to be that strong. And that's what I think for the beak and also for the feet of the duck. It's going to be a very similar mix. So this is beak and feet. If you like this kind of videos, don't forget to like and subscribe, and it supports me. I feel like someone is appreciating the work I put into to do these videos. So yes, that would be super appreciated if you do those two things. Then I'm thinking for the belly of the duck, that's another interesting point that I want to include. I'll be starting with the same mix of primary yellow and quinacridone red, or primary red magenta. It's the same thing to me. You'll end up at about a similar result. So here you go. So this is my yellow, and I'm mixing the colors straight on the paper. By the way, this is cellulose paper. It's nothing fancy because anyway, these are just color swatches. So this is going to be my belly. You can make it a bit more muted if you'd like. For now, I'll just keep the colors pure because it's easier to work with. What I want to say is that the belly is orange, and the local color of this duck is basically a bluish cool color. So again, it makes me think of cobalt blue because it's gentle. So I'll pull out cobalt blue and I'll put it here. It's not pure. It's a little dirty, this cobalt blue. There you have it. Now it's pure. So if I were to pull this cobalt blue into the orange, it's going to end up in a kind of greenish or muted mix. But if I go through magenta, this mix is not to be as neutral as the blue to orange mix. Look, we're going to blend the colors together. Taking it there. I'm pulling the cobalt blue into the orange. It's actually a very pretty mix. It's neutral, but it's not dull. And now to think about tonal values in the shade are between 6 and 9, and cobalt blue is already around value 7. This area in the duck is not value 7, right? This is more like a 5, maybe a 4 even, because it's white and it's in the dark. So whites in the dark can be tricky sometimes. And that's why when you paint the belly, you're going to be using a thick consistency, creamy consistency of orange paint. But when you're going to paint the body of the duck, it's going to be a watery consistency because you want to take this cobalt blue a little bit down the tonal value scale. As a beginner, I was making this mistake, or I would get lost mid-painting because I didn't know the direction I was going, or how much paint was enough paint, or when it was the time to stop. So now you know, with the blue, you stop at a watery consistency, and with the orange, you need to take it to a more like creamy consistency. These are two important points. And the transition, you have to eyeball it. You kind of mix it as you go, and it's going to be somewhere in between. And one thing that I forgot to mention, the belly is going to be orange, and orange needs to be creamy. But I don't go straight with creamy consistency paint onto the paper. It'll be streaky, it'll be blotchy. It's not very nice to see. So I'll be working my colors from watery up to milk consistency, and then eventually I'll be ending up on a creamy consistency. And by the way, if you're wondering, by watery consistency, I mean this is water for me. That's water. When the paint is very flowy, very runny, for me, that's water. So you can see the paint, but you also see the water in it. But milk consistency is more like this for me. Look. But this is milk. So it's a little less flowy. You cannot distinguish between the water and the paint particles. And for creamy consistency, like it's the paint straight out of the tube. Very thick. It doesn't spread, doesn't move. It stays where you put it. These are the three differences: watery, milky, and creamy. The eyes are technically a focal point too, but these eyes are very tiny and they don't really add much to the picture, so I'll be just painting them with some burnt umber or indigo. I'll just stick to these two colors, and I'll be sure to keep the light, the little highlight inside the eye, and that will be enough for the eyes on this duck. Also because I'll be painting this duck on an A5 piece of paper, which is not that big. Yeah, let's swatch the background because why not? Background, like I said, we'll keep it a little lighter compared to this reference picture. So I'll be starting with a watery wash of yellow ochre. Here is yellow ochre. Putting down quite a generous amount because we want this to mix naturally with phthalo blue. Phthalo blue, I'll pick out this one. Doesn't matter if it's red shade or blue shade, that will pretty much end up in a very similar mix. And let's pull it in. So you can see here that the result you're gonna get is going to be quite an orangey, warm mix. And that's perfect, it matches perfectly. Once the paint here dries, you're going to see that this color is very similar to this color. And the consistencies that we're thinking are, again, yellow ochre is a little deeper compared to a regular yellow. So let's say it's around value 6 already, which is good because you want to be in the shade for this area. The background is a shaded part of this picture. This one is not that difficult because it's not a light subject or anything you need to be too careful of. You work wet on wet, you lay on your yellow ochre until you think it's enough. I mean, you can take it down to creamy, but it doesn't need to be too creamy. And then you layer on top of it some phthalo blue. Phthalo blue is around 8. Don't go in with creamy consistency because it may be too much too soon. So maybe start with milky and then you can thicken it up with creamy. And I actually like the part up here being a little darker as opposed to the bottom side and all around it. So this is where I may use some burnt umber or indigo, but I will make all those decisions as I go. I like to have this planning and swatching done ahead of starting a painting. I find it nice to look back at, and I don't need to think of anything new when I'm painting. For the rocks, I will be using cobalt blue or even French ultramarine. Doesn't matter, they're very similar. So cobalt blue, some magenta. For the rocks, you see, you will get this kind of result. And maybe I'll just neutralize this mix a tiny bit. You can use burnt sienna or yellow ochre, will change the hue a little bit more. So let's go with the complementary burnt sienna. That's maybe too much here. Just okay, like this. It's going to be a very pretty, gentle, neutral, and it's going to be at a watery to milky consistency. Because like we said, when you want a light hue of a blue color, you want it to be watery. So this is it. Yeah, that's my thinking. I start from the subject, I focus on the glow, I swatch constantly, and I let the values guide my color choice. And once this blending is done, the painting itself feels much calmer. You already know which colors to put and where. You just have to think of color placement. And by the way, now this swatch has dried. Look how similar it is to the background. All right, so thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it till the end, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye-bye! Hi, welcome to my studio. Today we're painting a duck in watercolor, and we're gonna keep it simple and fun, and most importantly, easy to paint. In fact, you can just follow my steps. I do have a video about how I plan the values and the colors for this duck. I will leave the link in the description below, so feel free to head over there and maybe watch it ahead of painting this duck. I think it's a very good idea just to get a grasp of the way I approach this subject, how I plan the values, the colors. Yeah, the video is really packed with really good stuff. So without further ado, let's dive into the painting. The first thing I do is wetting the duck within the lines and applying my first layer of colors. I like using the wet on wet technique because it's such a forgiving way to paint, and I let the colors do the blending. I'm starting with a kind of orange. This is a mix of imidazoline yellow and quinacridone red. I'm using Holbein watercolors, and I like them because they don't really spread much on wet paper, which allows me to have more control. And as for the paper, I'm working on Arches cold press paper. This is one of my favorite papers. It's ideal for long sessions of wet on wet technique in watercolor. So it's definitely my #1 choice together with Saunders Waterford. And I'm applying this mix on the duck's belly and also the duck's feet because they're both on the same shade of orange. So I'm basically treating them as a block of color. Now, here comes the most interesting part of this painting, which is to me the transition from the belly to the back of the duck. I really like this gradient, and it's kind of tricky if you don't know how to approach it because it goes from a warm orange to a cool blue. And because blue and orange are complementary colors, when they meet, they actually neutralize each other, which is an effect that we want to have, but we don't want it to be too dull. And that's why between orange and blue, I'm introducing some magenta. It's just a little bit, it's not too strong, but then magenta will help the transition be smoother and a little brighter. When I paint, I like to have my tonal values and Masstone scale next to my painting because it tells me how creamy to push my paints. And here is a practical example. The transition belly to back of this duck is all around value 6. It doesn't really shift that much. What is changing is just the color. And here is when my tonal values and Masstone scale comes in handy. This scale combines the relationship between the mass tone of a color and its value. And the Masstone is the color of a certain pigment straight out of the tube. So it's when it's its creamiest consistency and also its darkest value. I know this may sound a bit confusing and maybe too technical, but once you get the hang of this thinking, your watercolors will really change for the better. And my goal here is to teach you how to paint on your own without always referring to a tutorial. What I was saying is that the duck's body is basically around value 6. And to get there with orange and with blue, because that's the gradient that's happening here, we need to, first of all, have a creamier consistency of orange, close to the Masstone color. And as for the blue, we cannot match the same consistency because blue has a darker Masstone value. So you're going to need creamy orange and more diluted blue, more like milky consistency. This is an effect you want to achieve gradually. If you're comfortable doing it all in one go, that's fine, but if not, you can always let your watercolor dry and go over with the second layer to adjust the intensity of the color. In this case, it's the orange we need to push to a creamier consistency and value. And by the way, if you're interested in my tonal values and Masstone scale, I'm going to leave the link in the description below. Sometimes I get some requests of people asking me if it's for sale, so yes, it is, and you can check it out. And now I'm painting the beak. I started with the first layer of pure orange, and I'm going over it with some quinacridone magenta, just where the color gets more intense. And I'm sticking kind of close to that reference picture. So if you're painting along, take your time. Sometimes you feel like you have to pause the video, please do it. Or you can just let it run and go back to certain places. all you need to focus on is mixing the colors correctly, so match the steps that I did before, and also watch your paint consistency and be careful of how the paper is drying, because definitely that has a different timing compared to my paper. And don't forget to have fun. That's what watercolor is all about. Here I'm just intensifying the duck's feet. I'm applying a darker red over that orange, and to intensify that red I used a touch of phthalo blue because it has a very strong Masstone, and that gets me to a quite darker value without overworking or overmixing my red and blue. Now I'm wetting the area where the rocks will go. Just a quick one because it's an A5 piece of paper. It's not that big of a painting. I'm focusing on not overworking. Sometimes just place the paint and let it be. Watercolor looks best when it's not overworked. The colors I have on my brush are cobalt blue, some magenta, and some burnt sienna. Okay, so this is one of my favorite mixes, and the reason is because it gives me this warm purple that's not too saturated, and it's almost like a silver kind of purple. Yes, I really, really enjoy this shade. And by the way, I may have skipped this one before, but I'm working on cold pressed paper. This one is Arches, and I'm using Holbein watercolors mainly. The brushes I'm switching between some silver black velvet round 12, and I also have a round 8, but I'm also using some smaller brushes later on. Those are Da Vinci, and I use them for small details. Now I'm going to deepen some areas, specifically where the rocks crevices are, and I'm using the same mix I used before, just in a more intense form. So this is more like a little more than a milky consistency. It still spreads a little bit, but it's not as runny anymore. You can actually see different colors coming out of my brush strokes because I just did a rough mix, and I like it this way because it's more dynamic. It's not like one single color. And the thing is, like, when you work with rocks, think of them as an abstract part of this painting. So feel free to add some salt if you have it, or if you like and enjoy that technique, or you can even do some splatter on the rocks to add that texture, or some dry brushing. That's all up to you. Now I'm starting to wet the background, and I'm actually not very comfortable using this small of a brush for this, but the fact is that I want my fine tip to define the outer shape of this duck, so I'm not gonna switch to flat brush. This one has a very nice fine point, which I find very handy. When you're working on this step, please be mindful of not wetting any part of the duck, because there could be a bleeding of the background running over the duck with your paint, and in that case you may kill some highlights, perhaps like the ones on the head or on the beak. So you need to keep those areas extra light. If that makes you feel more comfortable painting, maybe consider using some masking fluid. My base color here is yellow ochre, and I'm going over it with a slightly mixed yellow ochre and phthalo blue. Paper is wet and I have some paint on my brush that's about at a milky consistency. So I have to expect there's gonna be some fading once this layer dries. So the goal here is not to get everything done in one go, but rather adjusting the values as I go. And I would encourage you to just take your time for the background because in this case the background is really what makes this subject pop. Here I'm working very carefully because I want to preserve those white hedges. Once you run over them with any darker paint, the white of the duck is gone, it's lost. If you make a mistake, you can use a paper towel to dab the paint, try to get it off the paper. And yes, paper towels in watercolor really work like an eraser. Before I lay down any brush stroke, I always make sure that the paper is still at the wetness level that I want it to be. And here it wasn't wet enough, so I went over it with some clear water. And sometimes it's really very useful to work with two different brushes. In one brush, I have some yellow ochre, and the other brush, my flat brush, is actually just loaded with clear water, which helps me guide the pigment where I want it to go. And I'm taking things slowly, but eventually I want to land around value 9, 8 to 9 with this background. And to do so, I'm always looking at my tonal values and Masstone scale. I find this tool super helpful because it basically tells me when to stop. Sometimes in watercolor, that's not so intuitive, and this serves me as a good reminder of all the paint consistencies that I want to get to. I'm laying down a heavier layer of yellow ochre right behind the rocks because that's where the water is the lightest. I'm not as concerned on the top because I'm going to be covering that area with much darker paint later on. Like I said, for this painting, I'm sticking pretty close to the reference picture because it really works. There isn't much to change on the reference. Duck glows and I really like how the colors are. Probably the only thing I'm doing slightly differently are the rocks that I'm keeping lighter. But other than that, I'm quite happy with the picture. And the thing about yellow ochre and having it as an underpainting is that it really gets that golden feeling into the picture. Even if you don't see it anymore, even if it's going to disappear, that golden appearance is still going to be there in your background. And here I'm recreating those ripples in the water, just going with the flow. Sometimes I glance at the reference and I include what I think looks nice, what it's worth including. I'm just going for the most evident strokes, in this case the ripples in the front and also the darker background coming down from the top. Sometimes I just layer some pure phthalo blue on top of the yellow ochre and the two colors will be mixing straight on the paper, which is something I really like. It's a very natural, spontaneous way to blend together. And this way also you avoid incurring into muddy mixes. As the paper dries, I expect my paint to spread less and less, and so the direct consequence of this is that the paint will be more intense. I'm also getting a creamier paint on my brush, so that's also one of the reasons why everything's getting darker gradually. But yes, the fact that the paper is not like shiny, wet is an indicator that things are getting darker from now on.
And you don't have to copy every single stroke that I'm making. The beauty of painting is that every painting is unique. So embrace it and see where this tutorial takes you to. I personally enjoy working with a flat brush because you can make bolder strokes, although this paper is not that big, but still it's kind of freeing to swipe the brush across the page. Such a good feeling. Now I'm basically lifting some paint to recreate lighter strokes in the water, those lighter waves, so things look more realistic, and also to add variety. I'm just using my flat brush. I squeezed out all the water so it's not soaking wet anymore. And yes, if you're trying to recreate this effect, make sure there is no extra water on your brush because that would create a bloom. But otherwise, it's pretty safe if your brush is damp and you don't have any extra water on it. It's such a fun process. I don't know. There are different stages in watercolor that I enjoy, and this one here is one of the highlights for me. And now some splatter. Splatter works best when you see the paper is kind of like matte looking. There is no more shine on the paper, no more glistening from the paper. And yes, that's when you know that your lifting is going to work well and also your splatter will be visible. And the darker the paint that's on your page, the better the splatter will look. And now we're mid-painting and it's time for me to reassess my values because the page dried and we can observe some kind of drying shift happening there, some fading that happened, but it's nothing too dramatic. And what I like to do here is to compare the values on my painting to the values on my tonal values and Masstone scale and see if I need to improve on something. And by the way, here there was a little glitch. I basically inadvertently deleted the footage that I made for my first painting, and this is a different painting that I'm going to continue painting from the same stage we were at, but it's effectively the same duck with the same background. Now I'm rewetting the background because I'm going in with another layer. I want these colors to be a little more saturated. And I also want it to be a little darker so that the lightest part of the painting will appear even lighter. And this is just based on color and value relativity. So what I'm doing now is kind of self-explanatory. I'm just adding some yellow ochre to the water to add a bit more color to it because I like color. That's my thing. And that yellow ochre really adds that golden reflection to the water. And now it's time to paint the eye. The eye, like I said in my previous video where I explained my colors and the parts I'll be focusing on this painting, the eye is not a focal point because here it's such a tiny little thing. It doesn't need to be overworked. And so I'll keep it simple because even though it's not a focal point, it still anchors the face, but definitely it doesn't need any kind of overthinking. And so I approach it by color temperature. What do I mean by that? The iris is the part of the eye that comes forward. And so for this part, I'm going to be using a warm dark mix, which is going to be made of burnt umber and some kind of red. Here I used a standard warm red, which is pearl red. And then for the parts that are more tucked in, like the ones in the shade, like the rim on the eyelid, upper and lower eyelid, there I used indigo because I want those things to recede. And it's pure indigo, so a cool dark color. And because of the glitch that happened with the footage, I couldn't include the part where I detailed the beak, but I basically did some negative painting with the Perot red on the nostril and also the beak's line. And the same goes for the duck's feet. I used again, like I think I mentioned it earlier, but I used a mix of Perot red and some blue, table blue. And I intensified the colors on the duck's body with the same mixes I used in the first layer. And I just went in, again, wet on wet with a milky consistency. I always paid attention to keep the right side of the duck paper white so that you can suggest a very strong sense of light coming from the right side of the picture. And this is it. I hope you enjoyed painting this duck along with me. I want to encourage you now to understand the way that I think about a watercolor piece, take my ideas and try them on a subject different than this duck, and see how they work out. And if you feel like sharing, you can tag me on Instagram. My account is MK.Watercolor.Studio. I'll be very happy to see your works there. Thanks for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao!
Hey you, do you want to learn how to paint a soft glowing watercolor deer without overworking your layers or making muddy colors? If so, stay tuned because this video is all about it. Not only I'm going to be painting in real time this deer with you, but I will show you my technique to create soft and vibrant transitions without running in muddy colors or an overworked painting. Are you ready to join? So the first thing that I'm doing is getting the deer wet. And I always recommend starting the first layer with a wet on wet technique, meaning that you're applying wet paint over a wet surface. This is the perfect way to get very soft and smooth transitions. And if you're making any mistakes, don't worry, the first layer just counts barely. It's only for you to map out where to put your highlights and where to apply your midtones. And obviously, I'm just talking for myself. This is the way I paint, and I find that the first layer is very, very freeing. You shouldn't be thinking too much about it. Just enjoy it because it's the most fun part of the painting. So, what am I doing here? I am basically giving a color to the white fur. And that color for me is a mix of primary red magenta and cobalt blue. I'm using a mix of Holbein paints and My Mary Blue watercolors, and the reason is because My Mary Blue watercolors tend to disperse on a wet surface very fast, while Holbeins, they just stay where you put them, and I find that the perfect way in between is actually mixing them together. And here is my thinking process on how to tackle this deer color-wise. You can see that the fur has a warm tone, so that's going to be my midtones. So the colors I would reach out for in my palette are basically like any kind of primary yellow. I also use transparent yellow because this one has like a very strong kick to it, and I like to use it when I'm painting warm subjects. I'm also using primary red magenta, both for cool tones and for warm tones. I feel like this one creates very vibrant mixes. And obviously, to warm up that fur, I will be using burnt sienna or transparent Mars red. So how am I going to contrast this overall local color, which is basically a color gradient that goes between yellow and red, so yellow, orange, red. I will do this by choosing some cool colors on the other side of the color wheel. I'm going to apply a very thin layer of blue, and also for the white fur under the neck of the deer, I'll be using a mix of purple. I am all for wet on wet techniques. I love it. That's the way that I feel like it expresses my style the best. And I'm wondering, what is your style? Do you have a favorite technique? Do you have a favorite stage in your painting? If so, let me know in the comments below. Now that we have mapped all our highlights, we need to start thinking about our warm colors. And there you have it, your first warm brush stroke. So now you need to be extra careful because you have those blue and purple tones and you're putting down the warmer colors. It's so easy to make a muddy mix on the paper at this stage. You're putting down warm tones and you already have some blue on this deer. So if this yellow is going to touch the blue, obviously it will create green, and this deer is anything but green. I am carefully avoiding those blues and purples with my brush, and I apply the paint in very gentle brush strokes. I'm basically gonna keep putting down my yellows for all the white areas you can see pretty much on this deer.
After that, I will go in with some orange to intensify the color. So the orange will be a mix of primary yellow, transparent yellow, and primary red magenta with burnt sienna or transparent Mars red, whichever you have on your palette. I sometimes like to use a fan brush to help the paint mix together smoothly. It holds little to no water, so you don't go in your painting with extra water and you don't risk to create a bloom using this brush. This is a very handy dandy little guide that I recommend you in case you ever come across it or you feel like you don't know whether to buy it or not. It's actually very useful. Now I'm still working wet on wet and I'm going to intensify the previous layer of yellow that I put down before. This is a very clear example of what I mean by not creating muddy colors. How are you not going to create those muddy colors? You can see I'm painting in gradient. That's what I like to call it, which means I first applied yellow, like plain yellow, then I went over it with a more interesting kind of yellow. Now it's even more intense, which means that I'm going in with the shade of orange, and after that I will go in with the shade of brown. It's actually not pure brown, but it's also a mix of orange, yellow, and a little touch of blue. Next, I'm going to start adding some details, and I'm using primary red magenta for the mouth, the nose, and the nostril of this deer. Now it's time to move on to the ears, and I will be tackling them the same exact way I used to do it before, because again, this is how you keep your colors clean. I will be starting with the lightest color and I will be gradually increasing the color temperature that I'm using. And I'm sorry if I'm skipping ahead sometimes in this video, but I wanted to keep the pace a little faster so it's not a super boring, extra long video. If you need some extra time, I would encourage you to pause it and catch up with your painting. I know the water is drying for you too on the page if you're following along. It's not that easy to stay on top of it, so pause the video if you need to. You can even go back and look at it or go next and see what's coming up next so that you are prepared with the supplies that you're going to need. But don't worry, I'm always using the same colors anyway, so you should be good with that. Many times you're going to see me softening the edges with this damp brush. I don't like to change my brush too much when I paint. I'm kind of a lazy painter, I would say. So if you are a lazy painter too, just like I am, what you can do is you clear your brush from the paint that it's holding, and then you squeeze out all the water. So you open up the bristles and you can fan through the painting to just, make everything looking smoother. This is a rather large painting. It's a 16 by 12 inches. Every time before putting down a new layer of paint, I need to make sure that the paper is still wet. How do I do this? I find that the back of my hand is one of the most sensitive parts of my hand to check on the paper, so that's why you see me sometimes gently touch the paper with the back of my hand. Here I switched to a smaller brush. This is a Da Vinci Cosmotop Spin number 3, and I'm going in finally with medium dark tones to push back some parts of the ear. So we're going to start to intensify those colors even more, getting closer to our darks. Putting the darkest darks in is also one of my favorite parts. It's really satisfying to finally see this painting coming to life. It's a little bit like sculpting, and now your painting is not appearing flat anymore. Now I'm on to the other ear, and I will do the same exact things. Here you can see that my brush was loaded with a bunch of different colors. You can see yellow, you can see red, and the burnt sienna or transparent Mars red. I don't remember exactly what I used. I think I made a mix of them both. And I'm not doing much. I'm just putting down the color and observing what it does. More color, more darks, and pushing that part back. And stay away from the highlights. Don't cover the entire ear with red, yellow paint, because otherwise it will be a very flat painting. The thing with watercolor, especially if you're working with wet on wet, the paint tends to dry out lighter, and that's called the drying shift. You need to be aware of that, especially when you're painting with your yellow colors. Yellow is a color that has a very light value tone. So in one hand, it's very easy to paint with yellow because it's not an overwhelming color. But on the other hand, if you're painting something that has an intense color, it gets kind of tricky to gauge when this yellow is on the right intensity scale, because if it's too light, then this yellow is not going to support your oranges or your red the way it should be. It appears too weak, and once you put on your midtones with the orange reds, that yellow, like I said, it's just too weak, and you would have to go over what you painted with a new layer. And you must be careful when you do this and choose a transparent color. That's why transparent yellow is perfect for glazing to fill in that gap. Now I'm going to paint the eye, so down to the small details, and I start with the lightest tones. First, the highlights are blue, like I said before, and then I will paint the pupil with a red color mix. Color theory applied. The cool part tends to step back a little bit, and when you paint something with some red pigments in it, that can be any kind of like pearl red and burnt umber. Whenever you use red, those red colors tend to push the object forward. It looks closer to you. Now I'm basically intensifying the creases between the neck of the deer. And again, I'm working wet on wet, and I'm using a mix of red and blue, which gives this kind of off purple, which is perfect for just some shadowing color. And here I made a very dark mix of blue and red. I believe this is primary blue cyan from primary blue and pearl red, which gives me, again, a very intense dark. I'm using it to intensify the darkest part of the eye and the nose too. These dark accents are what make a painting special. They tie it together, they give it that extra dimension. Now you can see the darkest part of the nose, it's sticking out quite a bit, while the lightest part is receding in the back. Now I'm painting the background wet on wet. I'm using quite a large brush. This is a size 24, and I'm using a combination of French ultramarine, primary red magenta, and burnt sienna. I absolutely love the combination these three colors can create together, especially this warm burnt sienna and purple shade that I'm putting down right now. So if you're painting along, please make sure to have fun, especially when you do the background, because it's supposed to be fun. Watch the paint flow and mix together, play with that water, try different color combinations, try something new if you can. For me personally, I find it very relaxing just to watch the paint move on the paper, and I also enjoy tilting the paper quite a bit to help the paint flow. 1 minute after painting the background, once the paint is starting to dry, I will add some splatter just for fun. It gives the painting that dreamy looking effect that I really like, and I often recreate in many of my animal paintings. What I did next is that I let the paint completely dry, and I went back to it the day after to remove the mask and fluid. I didn't really like how thick those masked hair looked like. I thinned them out. Same I did for the spots on the back of the deer. They were too white compared to the deer. I basically just reactivated the paint on the fur and dragged that dirty water over those hair to make it look more organic. Then I added my signature to the painting, and it was done. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. That really helps me a lot as a new creator here on YouTube. So, I'll see you next time. Bye! Hi, welcome to my studio. So today I'm making this cat video, and it's actually a little bit different from my usual tutorials. Today it's just like a calm, chilled painting session, and this is going to be 100% me just talking to you, sharing my insights along the way. And so if you choose to go ahead and keep watching this video, you should know that we're already friends. You're basically signing up for 1 hour of hearing me ramble, and I love that for you. Anyways, jokes aside, the reason why I chose this reference is because this cat had these very beautiful deep blue eyes. The other thing that I really loved about this reference is the fluffy fur on this cat. Two beautiful things, but the downside of this reference is that it didn't really have much color to it. It was quite grayish, so I had to come up with some colors and maybe a little more exciting background. I hope it translated into my painting you're seeing here. Yeah, I think I'll leave the link to the picture below in case you're interested, and I don't know, if you wanted to paint along with me and try to interpret this cat, like following my steps, but also adding your own twist, that's gonna be great. And just so you know, I'm not going to be talking the entire time. I'll be adding some commentary from time to time when something relevant comes up. I hope you don't mind. And now let's dive into the painting. The way I started this painting is by blocking in the light color. And I used some soft yellows like primary yellow, raw sienna, and before applying these colors I wet the paper. I'm working wet on wet, and I think this technique is especially good for backgrounds because it creates that soft blend of colors. For this first wash, I'm using Holbein watercolors, and you can actually tell by the way they don't spread on wet paper. And I really like this. It allows me to have more control over something that I'm painting. And before someone is going to write something, I know guys, the camera angle, what was I doing here? I guess I wasn't sure if this would have been a short or a long form video, but yeah, in hindsight, I should have turned the camera. Here I'm using again some kind of like yellow plus a touch of quinacridone red. That's what brings that warmth to the paint I'm using. This is basically a warm underpainting. The cat has a grayish, cool local color for the fur on its face. Just gentle strokes here and there, no pressure. Here I wanted to start defining the inside of the cat's ears. I'm adding some shadows under the cat's belly to define that area a bit more. And now I'm going in with some cooler tones. It's basically the same mix as before, just that I added a touch of cobalt blue or French ultramarine blue. Whichever one you have on the palette, if you're following along, could work really well. Again, here, this is negative painting. I'm defining the shadows on the fur, lifting up some color. And I like to smudge a little bit that yellow light, because that's what makes the painting feel like it has a strong sense of light. Working on the ear, that was maybe a bit too much water, so I'm trying to move it around the painting a bit, spread it around so it's not going to puddle and create possible blooms. Now it's time for painting the mouth, the muzzle rather, some pinkish tones. This is a mix of quinacridone red, some little touch of burnt sienna, and whatever other things I have on my palette to make it a little more muted. Here I'm starting with the colors of the fur. Like, yes, the fur is white, but that's a shadow area and I need to give it some color, some tint. I didn't want to keep it white or else it'll be super boring. But I feel like you could already see the contrast between the warm environment and the brightness of the cat. When it comes to the fur, I don't want to paint the fur hair by hair. I'm basically trying to block in the light and the shadows in this fluffy furry cat. Yeah, just some suggestions are enough for me, but it's fun, so sometimes I get carried away. I think I forgot to mention that I am using a limited color palette for this painting. The main colors I'm using are obviously yellows, so primary yellow, raw sienna, some yellow ochre. I also have on my palette quinacridone red, burnt sienna, French ultramarine, and cobalt blue. These are the blues I'm reaching for this painting. I always keep a paper towel next to me when I'm painting because it serves me as an eraser. It's a great way to just dab off little mistakes or when you notice you went in with a different hue than you intended to. So here's the thing. As you can see now, I'm laying down a cooler shadow, which is basically made of the same mix as before and some kind of cobalt blue or French ultramarine blue. It really doesn't matter. Oh, and by the way, by French ultramarine, I mean French ultramarine light. They're very similar in hue, these two colors. And these two are my go-to blues because they don't overpower the mix I'm making. Like, unlike phthalo blue, these two are quite gentle, pretty easy to use, let's say. Anyway, when I work with a blue mix with or something that has that kind of blue in it, I need to keep my mix a little more watery. And that's because blue has a Masstone that's kind of like pretty dark, between value 7, 8, depending on the hue. And so I was saying there are two ways to keep the mix kind of like light but not too watery, especially like if you're already at a certain stage in the painting and the paper is kind of drying but not exactly dry and not exactly wet. So the way you control this, it's in two different ways. Number one, you can blot your paintbrush on a towel. Number two, you can add some white watercolor to your mix. And what basically white watercolor does is thicken up the paint consistency. I think this is a very good way to work around this water control game. It's maybe easier this way, but obviously your watercolor is not going to be transparent anymore, so you need to be very careful of not running into a muddy mix like this. Yeah, so there are some things that are in favor of white color and some other things that are not very favorable about it. Here I didn't use white watercolor, but I don't look down at it. Like, I actually like it quite a bit. And recently I've been incorporating the white watercolor a bit more in my paintings because of this reason. It's not bad to use it actually. At first I thought that it was not the right way to do watercolor, if that makes sense. But now I'm just embracing it. To keep the paper wet longer, I use a spray bottle that makes a very fine mist. And that makes me think that if you know you want to have your paper wet for a long time, one option is to wet the back of your paper. That's what I do sometimes. When I use the block, a paper block, obviously I don't do that, but more often than not, when I use a sheet of paper, I wet the back too. I have to be honest, I painted this cat over 2 nights because that's the free time I have and I don't want to stay up till late, so I didn't do it in one go. And I can actually tell that from my palette, the palette I'm using. Sometimes I use the palette where I have only Holbein watercolors on it. Some other times I use my MK.Studio palette. And basically, like, on the Magello I have my Mary Blue watercolors. When I use those colors, it's mostly for glazing because of their transparency. They're really good for that. Here I'm using my Mary Blue, I suppose. I also have some Holbein on it. But I think this is more like yellow ochre, which the one I have for now is a my Mary Blue one. And it behaves very similarly to any kind of Holbein watercolor. So It doesn't spread really far, just within reason. And the hue is also quite similar to a standard, like any kind of standard yellow ochre. Very predictable, I would say, reliable. What was I saying? I kind of lost my train of thought. Yeah, I'm using the Magello palette, which means we are on night one of this painting. Like right here, I'm intensifying the colors. I'm adding some more local color to where I feel like it needs it. This is very fun for me to do. I am using a mix of kind of like some kind of blue, yellow ochre, quinacridone and red. Most likely that blue is going to be French ultramarine, according to the darkness of it. I can tell it's not a super dark blue. Quite dark, but not very dark. Yeah, this fun is super. This fun, this part is super fun for me because you're starting to shape the cat. It's kind of satisfying to put down those stripes on the cat's head. It means the cat is coming together. And if we want to be technical, which I love, I'm all about technicalities, we are laying down the darker midtones. We're not on our darkest darks, we're on our dark midtones. Quite different. And probably we'll need one more layer. They're gonna dry off a little lighter, I suppose. I'm using my Murray Blue, and I know that's something that happens. Many times I find myself using two layers for more intensity. And just to be clear, that's not a bad thing. It's just the way you work with different materials. You need to adapt. Sometimes, people say, okay, I have my art style. My art style is this, is that. But what people don't tell you is that many times that art style is coming from the materials they're using, because everything needs to be handled a little bit differently. Okay, my favorite brands for watercolors are Holbein and My Mary Blue watercolors. I also really like Rembrandt, but I don't have many tubes of them. I feel like Rembrandt behave a lot like Holbein though. So yeah, these are my two favorite brands. And even if I like them very much, I work very differently with both of them. And the same goes for the paper. I really like Arches paper, and I really like Saunders Waterford paper. But again, they are slightly different papers, so I need to work in a different way with both papers. You're now seeing me use a flat brush and a fan brush. Many times I use this technique to lay down the paint and then make it settle the way that I want it to settle. And the fan brush is also very good for this because it doesn't really hold any water. I just make it damp and I will gently move the paint around the page where I want it to go. Yeah, so it's either this fan brush or I squeeze out the paint from a quill brush or any kind of brush I'm using. I prefer the fan technique a little better just for risk management, but they both work quite well. And yes, if you're interested in this kind of technique, you don't really need to go out of your way to buy a new brush. Just use whatever you have. You make it dry, you make it damp, and it will work.
I am now starting to create that glow, and anytime you layer or you create a temperature contrast in a watercolor painting, that's where the glow effect starts showing up. What I like to do is basically use yellow as the light, the color of the light. Sometimes I warm that yellow up with maybe some Indian yellow kind of color that will give it warmth. And then you layer on top of these two something like blue or blue purple, or even like blue purple and burnt sienna, and sorry, burnt umber. That one, it offsets the purity of the color of the blue tones a bit more, and this mix is spot on. Anytime a color is not pure, it really brings some realism and all the goodness you can get from a painting. And here you're seeing my brand new water bottle spray. I love this one. It was $4 well spent. I would buy it over and over again. I can use it very close to the paper when I want to create a more dramatic effect, some kind of like blooming effect, or when I want to push the paint away from a certain spot. Or I can just nebulize it. Is it a word in English? Nebulize? Anyway, spray some mist from far away and it will just re-wet the paper without doing anything really. It's not going to interfere with the colors. It's very, very good purchase I made. I'm very surprised and pleased by this. I switched to a smaller brush and I'm intensifying the areas where I feel like it needs more strength. So I'm using the same mix of French ultramarine, probably quinacridone red, and some kind of like yellow ochre or burnt umber to offset again the purity, like I said before, of this grayish parts. The paint I'm laying down now is creamier. You can see it on my palette, and the way to recognize it, well, the word is pretty self-explanatory, but basically like whenever in doubt, you can just tilt your palette. Basically runny paint just flows down the palette, it moves around. Milky paint behaves similarly, but you don't see the water in your mix anymore. And then when it gets a bit creamier, it moves less and less on your palette. So that's a good way to gauge your mix, I feel like. It all comes with experience. The more you paint, the better you'll get at mixing the right consistencies. And you need to know that like different colors need different paint consistencies at different stages. It's not a one fit all. This is why I created my tonal values and Masstone scale. With the yellows, for example, to get to a decent color, like a color that's actually noticeable and it will a color that will support your midtones, you need to push your yellow to a creamy, yeah, kind of like a creamy mix on wet paper. So when you're working wet on wet, because then you are taking in consideration the water on your page. So with the yellows, go in strong and decisive. But when it comes to the blues, you need to stay back a little bit. Even if you're working wet on wet, don't lay down a creamy consistency of blue right away, because that may end up being too much. And you don't want to go too dark too soon, so watch out from the blues. They're a little tricky because their Masstone is between value 8 and value 7. They can go all the way down to value 9 if it's an indigo. And for the reds are kind of easy because they're on value 7, which is like somewhere in between yellow and blue. They are way easier to manage than, let's say, a phthalo blue. Phthalo blue, the moment you mix it, it's already all over the mix if you're not careful and if you don't know how to use it. But once you get the hang of it, everything gets easier. That's the good news. Practice, practice, practice. That's all you can do.
And now it's almost time for me to start painting the eyes. I feel like the picture so far looks pretty good. After this one last shadow area, which is kind of like a very mild one, the eyes are the next thing on the list I should do. Okay, so I'm starting with the first thin layer of phthalo blue because phthalo blue is very bright. It's a very vivid color. So I want to use that one for the eyes. It's perfect for the for breaking all the muted colors that are down on this page now, because now everything is soft, everything is muted, but I want that pop of color that draws your attention straight away, and I think this is a good way to do it. I'm starting with a very thin layer, nothing crazy, and I'll be working in a different way compared to how I was working before. This is going to be a more realistic look in the cat's eyes I'm going for. And so I'm going to be needing my layers to dry off completely before adding a new layer. So I'm going to be working the traditional watercolor way. Yeah, so transparent, I'll be using transparent colors. I'll be letting my layers dry. And yeah, these two things, there isn't much to it. So, and yeah, a lot of patience, a lot of patience. I'm gonna be needing that. I'm not someone that really paints this way usually. It's still very fun, even if it's a small area, like the eyes are relatively small. It's still fun to dub in the hint of color that's more intense than the rest of the eye. That's very satisfying to me. Can someone relate? Very gentle brush strokes, and moving the paint also very gently. I lay down, then I take my eyes off for a moment, I focus on a different area, then I go back to the other part, and then I move the paint if necessary. That's the way I approach it. Here I noticed the nose needed a bit more depth, so I need some warmer colors in there and darker colors too. One common mistake many people make, or like not many people, like let's say many beginners, and including me as a beginner, I used to paint the nostrils very dark, like close to black, pitch black. And yes, I mean, I like neutral tint better than black, so that would have been my way to darken the nostrils. But instead, you should think of when you want to make those kind of areas a bit darker. So if you're painting human faces and you want to paint the ears, or if you're painting some animal features, and the nostrils are a great example for this, you should be making your colors start from like the local color, which is pink. So grab a gentle, not a gentle, grab a generous amount of that color. That's going to be giving the vibrancy. And then you want to desaturate the color, offsetting it by using some either complementary color or some kind of earthy pigment. Burnt umber works really well. I like it. But also, like, I would use neutral tint, why not? But just a touch, not too much and not pure. Another really good ingredient for like pink areas is adding burnt sienna, a mixer that will tone things down but warm them up too. So burnt sienna and magenta or quinacridone red are a great mix for this. Here I'm working on some negative painting. The mix is a phthalo blue mixed with primer red magenta, I believe. Anyway, the color itself doesn't really matter. What matters is if the color is a warm red or a cool red, in which case, in this case, it's a cool red. And as you can see, I started from a very deep dark color and then I watered it down. And I'm basically shaping now the fur in the back of the neck of this cat. And I'm using a Chinese calligraphy brush. This one is pretty good. I think it's quite handy when I want to portray animals' hair, because the bristles on this brush spread open quite a bit and they don't close right away. And even if the brush is wet or damp, they stay open. So it's something that I don't see much in other paintbrushes. I felt like the head was lacking some color, some vibrancy, so here I am glazing over it. You can see the mix is super watery. This is water consistency paint. You basically can see through it. Very thin, very diluted. And you can tell, but I'll say it anyway. When glazing, I work wet on dry because I don't want to disturb the layers underneath by wetting the paper again. I don't want to reactivate the layers. And I mean, even if I did, I'm quite confident that on this paper, like Saunders waterford paper, things are not gonna be moving as much. And also like the combination to me of Mimary blue watercolors and Saunders waterford paper together, the layers don't really move much underneath. But just to be safe, I'm working wet on dry. And to give an example of like the way I would compare these two kind of paints, if I were to use Holbeins on this paper right here, they would lift a little bit more. They're not gonna be as staining as the Mimary blues. So, like I was saying before, like different materials, different approaches, and things like the way you work really is influenced by your mediums. When it's about the pet's features, I always take my time to gradually build the layers because those are my focal points and I want them to be as accurate as possible, but not too accurate. I still like to keep it a bit mysterious, let's say. So I'm not gonna be super precise. I'm aiming for precision, but not really, if that makes any sense. Probably it doesn't. And now you can see a good example of that temperature contrast I always talk about. I'm introducing some yellow ochre in this eye, and you can instantly see how the yellow part comes forward more. It seems to appear closer to us. And for some mysterious reason, I paused the video, and here we are, where the eyes are basically painted. You can still understand where I push the contrast, where the darkest parts are. And it's all about gradients. When you work in watercolor, you always try to interject gradients going top to bottom, or left to right, or even diagonally. If you can spot those gradients, the way they develop and the colors they involve in them, you are mastering the art of watercolor. I feel like this is all it comes down to. These are my crisp details, and I do paint them wet on dry. I'm using a pure mix, I want to say, yeah, because it is a mix. It's water and paint, so it's a pure mix of quinacridone, no quinacridone, of phthalo blue. It gets down to a quite dark color, I have to say, quite dark value. I'm also placing that phthalo blue where the iris is, because I want the black or the neutral tint or whatever dark I'm using to have the bluish undertone. I'm always trying to convey the direction of those lines, the shape of the eye. Checking if the paper is wet. It was a little damp, and so I used a paper towel. More detailing, wet on dry. Here is very important not to rush anything, because it's a focal point. You don't want to screw things up here.
At this stage, I find myself working wet on dry, like I said, and placing the color and then softening the edges. Let's say these are just fine tunes. And if you were wondering, I do find this part a little more boring compared to the beginning of a painting. It's not loose, it's not freeing anymore. It needs to be super controlled, super precise, and my hand is a bit shaky. I can't hold it still that much. So, yeah, I'm hanging in there and doing my best not to make squiggly lines here. And if you were wondering, I believe I was actually bouncing my baby, with my foot. So, there was some motion going on in my body too, but that's just between you and I. It wasn't the easiest way to paint a cat's eye. I already love how the eyes coming together, and although this part is a bit boring, like I mentioned, it's also very satisfying. The eyes are what give the painting life. And yet again, I'm adding some glazing. I felt like that wasn't making the cut before, so I added a more vibrant mix. This time I'm very sure that I used transparent yellow because it's a very punchy yellow, primer red magenta.
And that's the end of it. If you made it till the end, thank you so much for watching. I hope you got to enjoy and relax this painting session with me. Now you know all my secrets. See you next time. Ciao, ciao.
Hi, welcome to this Fox tutorial. I'm going to keep it very technical because that's what you told me you want to hear from me. So it's going to be simple but technical, full of juice. And the points that I'm going to be hitting in this video are the structure of the fox, so how I understand tonal values. Then we're going to be talking about my color choice and eventually how I layer the fox, which is pretty much the main part of the video.
And feel free to use the chapters below on the timeline of this video if you're not interested in a certain topic. So let me start from saying that the structure keeps everything consistent and readable, even before the color comes into play. And what structure am I talking about? Tonal values. To help with that, I use a tonal value and Masstone scale. And this is something I created for myself, and it makes the painting process much easier because I'm not guessing as I go. So I'm gonna go ahead with this tonal value study.
And this is the fox, right? When I see this fox, I liked it because it's very simple and it's easy to read. The first question I ask myself is, does this fox live in the dark or in the light? You can see the light comes from this direction. So the highlights are very visible. What do I do to start planning for a painting? I don't like to draw black and white sketches, thumbnails. That's not for me. I would be so bored if I did that. So that's why I made this tonal values and Masstone scale. I made it myself and I like it very much. I think it works well. So as you can see, all these values are light values. So everything that's in the light falls under those values. Things that are in the shade live along these values here. And 5 and 6 are transitional points
where light and shadow meet. So back to what I was saying before on how to read the fox's values. I start reading the lightest values, and these are the lightest values, so above the eyebrows. I know that's a yellow, so on my tonal value and Masstone scale, yellow is all in the light. That's where yellow lives by nature, because yellow is light. So I know I need to go in with a light and quite diluted version of yellow, around value 2 to 3.
If you're painting wet on dry, that's very easy to evaluate, but I'm working wet on wet, so I always need to account for that extra thickness in my paint because the paper is already wet. My paintbrush has paint plus some water, and when I go put the paint down, we dilute it even further. And yes, that's basically my thinking. The color plus the combination of light or shade tells me what value to go in at.
And that's basically what my chart helps me with. I tie together these two concepts so that I can paint without having to second guess what color or how much of the color I have on my paintbrush.
And then going down, we can see some oranges, and this is kind of like in the shade. You can see there's some darker orange, more intense orange. And I know from my value scale that the oranges live around this neighborhood and in Masstone again. So I already know that this is not exactly value 6, but it's more like value 7 because it's orange plus some black. So black is here, orange is here, so they're going to meet somewhere between 10 and 6, right? There's value 8, value 7. Anyway, this is how I approach my painting. Considering that I'm wetting the paper first to get here, I need to account for a Masstone of orange, or some yellow plus the red. In this case, I think that for this, I use the combination of imidazoline yellow, sandal red, as well as burnt sienna. So I combine these three to get around here. And when it's in the shade, I just added a touch of phthalo blue red shade to make it a bit more intense. But that's just minimal because if I go too blue, the shadow looks dead. Yes, this is how I approach my painting. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. And without further ado, let's get into the painting.
So for the chest fur, we're starting with a mix of indigo, French ultramarine, a touch of quinacridone red, and a touch of burnt umber just to offset the purity of those pigments. We are working wet on wet, so I'm wetting the paper. And yes, that fur is white, but there are also little spots of shadows in there that you want to give it a tone to. And just so you know, I didn't get to film this part, but the background was made of sap green, Holbein sap green. I forgot to mention this one before. French ultramarine from my Mary Blue, and a touch of burnt sienna to just tone it down, like decrease the saturation a little bit. And the reason why I chose these colors is the following. So if you look at the fox, like I said before, the fox is painted with yellow, red, and burnt sienna, right? So basically, I wanted to choose some contrasting colors, but also not at their maximum intensity. And what I did was, because green is the opposite of red and blue is the opposite of orange, I chose those two as the main tone of the background. And I added a touch of burnt sienna to turn down the volume a little bit. In fact, not only it turns down the volume of the background, but also it ties even so slightly with the fox, making it look more organic, because burnt sienna is both in the background and in the fox. And yeah, this is my thinking. And what am I doing here? Basically, I went in with the first wash of yellow. And keep in mind, the paper is wet, the brush is wet. So I think here I was using a mix of yellow gold, my Mary Blue yellow gold, and that pigment especially disperses more compared to Holbein watercolors. That's why you can see all this yellow halo around the fox, and that's intentional. I actually wanted the fox to be glowing with the warmth. And once that first washes down, I'm going in with an even thicker paint consistency. And I also increase the saturation with some burnt umber and a touch of red. If you're trying to follow this tutorial, don't stress too much about the colors. You don't need to match the colors precisely, but just it would be good if you have a standard red, like a warmer red, and a cooler red. That could be any magenta kind of red. Now I'm going in with an even thicker consistency of this paint. It's still on the orange side of it, so yellow, red, burnt sienna. And I'm going to place it where I see the richest colors, which is around the eyes, the ears, and between the fox's legs. Like the bottom part of the fox is pretty intense, so I will start to place this color down there too. When you're working wet on wet, the paper is drying, but the good news is that you don't need to go out of your way to reduce the paint consistency, because also the paint on your palette is drying. So just make sure you go where the paint is not as watery anymore when you pick it up. Watercolor works together on the palette and on the paper, just at a slightly different speed, but it's still doing the same thing. And feel free to pause this video at any moment so you can catch up with what I'm doing. I guess our papers are behaving and drying, and our paints too are drying at a different speed. So take your time. Now I switched to a small flat brush. This is a filbert. It's very tiny, and even if it's a cheap brush that I bought when I was a beginner, I like this brush because the water capacity is not that much, and it's actually great when you're working wet on wet, so you don't risk to bring in extra water when you go on to your painting. So I do encourage you to just work with what you have as much as you can. Especially now that I'm at a better level, I realize that sometimes I bought cheaper things and then I regretted it at some stage because they were cheap and they weren't as good as a Princeton brush, for example. But then now I'm going back to those first art supplies that I bought, because I don't know, I kind of like they have a second life now that my skill level is at a different stage. They just make more sense in a way. So use what you have and make a point out of it. And what I'm doing is basically I am intensifying the orange and the red, like it's more like a red orange at this point, around the fox's eyebrows and the forehead. I'm redefining the ears. Yes, and at this stage I need to be extra careful because the paper is not that wet anymore, and any extra water I bring in by mistakes can end up in a bloom. So the bloom is when basically a drop of water makes the paint that's already on the paper spread apart. When you see me rewetting the paper, it means that I'm going in with another layer. And especially when painting animals, I feel like wet on wet gives you such a natural fur look. Now we're moving into the middle to later stage of this painting, and here's where things get tricky. It's very typical to feel lost or just unsure of where you are at this point. This is also where my tool, I feel like, really comes in handy because it helps me personally evaluate my values and look at the painting with more objectively. So the question is, how do you judge the stage you're at? First of all, you can look at what's already on the paper, how dark the colors are, and that gives you one way to check. Another way is simply to look at what's on your brush. It's actually very insightful, and it's the answer number one to what you're doing. Look at how your paint looks like. Is it more watery or is it a thicker paint? That alone tells you a lot about where you are in the painting. So for example, if I'm working with orange, in this case it's a thicker orange. I know I'm in the midtones, and if it's a very pure, cleaner orange, then I'm still in the earlier midtones. That's what I understand. But once that orange starts getting darker, for example, if I mix it with burnt umber or a little touch of blue, I know at that point that I'm moving into the darker midtones of the painting that are going to be supporting the main shadows. And yeah, does that make sense what I'm saying? So that's basically how I gauge where I am. With that in mind, I always go back to my value chart. And so this allows me to analyze where the painting is sitting overall. Now I'm well into the darker areas of my painting, and for this I'm using a thick mix of burnt sienna, quinacridone red, burnt umber, and indigo. Now I'll be adding some details like the mouth crease and also the eyes and nose. These are basically focal points for me, and I usually paint them in layers. So for the eyes, I start with another painting, which is usually some blue and some like chocolate brown or golden brown, the color of the iris, and blue for the highlight. I'm sorry my hand was in the way, so it's not very easy to see what I'm doing here. In the next tutorial, I'll be improving on this point. For now, hang in there, and I can tell you what I'm doing still. So I'm basically also intensifying the shadow crease inside the ears. This mix is based on quinacridone red because the color inside the fox's ears is basically pink, very simply. So and how do I darken this red? I basically use two colors. One is burnt umber and the other one is indigo. What's the difference between these colors? Burnt umber pushes the mix slightly toward brown, while the blue reduces the saturation and increases the depth. I use a very small amount of both because they're very powerful and they keep the mix clean and balanced. They're basically warm and cool darks, and so when they meet, they neutralize each other. So when I'm darkening colors that are not fully dark, I like to keep my mixes as close as possible to their pure color because I want the shadow to still feel colorful and vibrant. And that's just my personal preference. That said, you can absolutely neutralize or darken your colors in other ways. Some people use neutral tint, Payne's gray, or even black, and there's nothing wrong with that. You are the painter, and how you chose to darken your colors is entirely up to you. And so these are also the colors that I used to create that second and darker layer on the fox's eyes and nose. It's basically like where I want it warmer, I go more toward burnt umber, and when I want to stay cooler, I go back to the indigo. It's always like a balance I try to recreate. And now I'm again painting the chest fur. Again, this is more like the same mix. We're getting darker here, so it's more like indigo quin red, just a touch of quin red because it looks a little purplish. So as you can see in the beginning, this part seemed quite dark when I first laid it down, and now it's almost like you can't even see it. It's all about color relativity and what color sits next to the other. So here we go. Let's add some darks, deepen those shadows, and when I'm happy with what it looks like, I'll be moving into the background again. I'm going to intensify that too because I want a bit more contrast. You can see on my palette that I reached again for some sap green. You can see a little puddle there. Yeah, so it's sap green and indigo and just the tiniest bit of burnt umber to offset the purity. I'm going for contrast. That's the main goal here. I'm reshaping the fox a little more, but most importantly, adding a darker layer to the background. I don't need to go that dark. I liked how the reference picture was, and I think I'll stick with that. More colors on my palette, and then This is very satisfying when I get to reshape the wider part of the ears as well as the muzzle. That's so good. You can actually see where the fox faces start. At this point, the painting is almost finished. I'm just making a few final adjustments and letting everything settle. If you watched all the way to the end, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what would you like to see next, or what you're currently struggling with in watercolor. I'd be very happy to cover that topic in one of my next videos. Also, if you painted along and you want to share a picture with me, I would love to see your result. You can tag me on Instagram or reach out to me. My profile there is MK.Watercolor.Studio. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Ciao, ciao!
Hey you, I'm so glad you're here. I've been really wanting to paint a horse today, and hopefully you can paint along with me. I came across a picture of this horse on the internet, and the horse is chocolate brown with some orange undertones on a snowy landscape, and it really spoke to me, so that's why I'm trying to paint it. I hope you can paint along with me. I think that could be really fun. In this painting, I'm using my My Merry Blue watercolors together with my Holbeins. The fact is that My Merry Blue paints, their dispersion is amazing. They go really far with just like the smallest amount of water. However, sometimes I want a little bit more control, and that's when my Holbeins come into play. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of this painting. What did I do here? First of all, I wetted the paper, excluding the horse, and I'm working on the background. This is snowy landscape, so the colors I chose are cobalt blue from Holbein. I used quinacridone red, also from Holbein, and I'm dropping in some warmer tones like yellow ochre, burnt umber, primary red magenta. These are my Merry Blue colors. Every time before I started painting, I need to visualize how the process would be and what is the look that I'm going for, how to make this painting fun and enjoyable to look at. Well, in this picture, I'm just trying to achieve a contrast between warm tones and cool tones. And as you can see, the background is definitely the cooler part of my painting. And so obviously the horse is the main subject of this painting, and so it will be the warm element in this painting. A little side note is that cool tones make usually the objects recede in the distance, so they seem to be more far away, and obviously warm tones, they pop out a bit more and they look closer to you. You may be wondering, didn't you say you're painting a chocolate horse? Yes, I did say that. All the brush strokes that you see now that have nothing to do with the color brown are placed there because those are going to be my highlights. And if you like my style, I do love highly saturated paintings, so I'm attributing different colors to different highlights. For example, in the face, you see I'm placing some yellow highlights, and that's because I want to make the face of the horse come out of the painting further. On the other hand, the back of the horse is obviously farther away from its face, and that's why I'm choosing some cool highlights for the back. And now comes the fun part, dropping in those midtones. Finally, I get to use the chocolate brown I mentioned before, and as you can see, I'm still working wet on wet. And I need to be a little careful because this paper is only an A4, it's not that big, so I don't have that much room to work with the colors and play around as much as I wanted to. So as much as I like working wet on wet, I need to be mindful because the painting can just turn into a mess. And how do I control my watercolors? Number one, I need to be careful of the water. So water control is key. If your paintbrush is too wet, your paint will be too watery, and the paint, when you put on the paper, it will spread everywhere. So be careful of the water in your paintbrush and of how wet the paper is in that moment. A little tip for you here, if you're not sure how wet the paper is, touch the paper with the back of your hand. That's gonna be a great way to feel the paper without disturbing the paint too much. If you're discreet, it's gonna be all good. And the back of your hand is way more sensitive than your fingertips, right? Now I'm re-wetting the paper. As you can see, I went in with a wash brush on the fence. I'm basically intensifying the colors on the fence. This time I'm using a liner brush and the paint consistency is definitely creamy. Here I'm wetting the snow, being careful not to touch the fence, and I'm just glazing some blue and magenta on top of the existing snow to make it a bit more vibrant. The same goes for the horse. I'm now intensifying the color of the body, the head as well. I'm now focusing on the mane and on the ears of the horse, dropping in more warmer colors and some darks. Why not starting to create that depth and dimension? I think that when I paint animals, painting the ears is the most satisfying part for me. How about you? What is the favorite part of painting an animal for you? Do you even paint animals? What's your way to go subject? I'm curious to know, and I would love if you would drop a comment in the description below. That could inspire me too. Now I downsized my brush. I went to a number 2, the silver black velvet brush. I really like this number 2 brush. I think before I was using the number 8 when I was painting the overall horse. This brush is very versatile. The particularity of it is that even though it's a number 2, it has a very fine tip. This brush still holds quite a bit of pigment in it, so I don't have to keep reloading the brush. To put in the smaller details, I'm working wet on dry to avoid any mistakes, any bleedings, or unwanted results. Naturally, when you work wet on dry, the lines are very defined. That's why after I put down the line, I softened up the edges to make it look more organic. I guess I could say that if it's about the background, I don't mind if it's a soft blended painting, but then as soon as we get closer to those most important details on a horse's face, I definitely want to go wet on dry to have more control to make them look crispier. Here is the thing, you can visualize the watercolor process as a pyramid. So first you start with bigger movements, bigger brush strokes, looser and bolder, and usually I work wet on wet in this phase. And that's where everything it's on the paper, it's loose, you don't need control. And that's the beauty of it, because watercolor will do its own thing at this stage. And after you have this first layer down, you can always correct things, you can always glaze on top of it, and you can make it more precise. So you go from a bigger scale all the way down, so you decrease gradually the size of your brushes, for example. You decrease the wetness of the paper. That's another thing. Approach the end of your painting, everything starts to look clearer and clearer. That's the beauty of watercolor. With its property of being so transparent, you can always go back and glaze over it, or you can intensify a shadow, you can make part of the paintings a bit more vibrant. And here's a perfect example. I'm adding a new horse, and because I thought this standalone horse not only looked a little lonely, but also it was lacking something. I don't know how to explain it, but I wanted to have something that's the darkest point in this painting. You see, I'm struggling to find the right words, but that's exactly what painting is like. A painter is feeling their own painting, so you're the only one who has that feeling of what you want the paper to look like, right? You know what the end result is supposed to be for you. We are approaching the end. That's when I took off the masking tape and putting in those last details. Now we are painting the horse's eyeball. I always start from the highlights, so I love cool highlights, I can't help it. So I will always put some blue as a highlight, blue or purple or some cool green. And yeah, what I'm doing is basically after putting down the highlights, I go over it, I glaze on top of it with a thicker paint that's more like brownish. It's a red brownish, it leans toward the red, and it's precisely how you create that contrast. Then I'm adding the eyelashes for this horse, and I'm also redefining the upper and lower eyelids. And I keep going back to it and assessing the painting, see where it needs more light, where it needs a little more dark, and then I will go in with some white gouache to restore those highlights that I lost. Here unfortunately I did not use masking fluid. And yes, after painting the eyes, we're getting really close to the end, so what I'll do is I take one step back. I usually walk away from the paper and I have a coffee or something like that. I always take a break before finalizing a painting, and that allows me to just look at the painting with fresh eyes. Those highlights were a little too spread out to me, although they seemed very near, close to each other before. Now that I have fresh eyes, it looks completely different, so I'm going in and glazing over the areas that I want to get a bit darker. But the face of the horse is not going to be darker. In fact, it's going to be warmer. That's what I'm going to do. I can definitely say that for me and for everybody, every artist out there, painting is something very personal. It's like reading inside someone. And if you're painting along with me, I'll be very curious to see what your painting looks like. How did this horse come out for you? Did you use the same colors? Or did you make different choices? And there it is, our watercolor horse. I really love how soft it turned out. Wet on wet can be a bit wild, but that's part of why I truly enjoy it. It feels like you and the paint are working together, doesn't it? Thanks for spending this time with me. If you liked how it turned out, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. It means a lot and helps me keep posting more watercolor tutorials and calm painting sessions like this. Okay, I'm gonna clean up my brushes and let this one dry. Thanks for keeping me company, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!